The person in charge of the federal government's student loan program resigned on Friday. Mark Brown was in charge of the Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid. He faced pressure from some progressive lawmakers and advocacy groups who were critical of the department's handling of student debt, especially during the pandemic when a freeze was put on federal student loan payments and interest. As head of the FSA, Brown oversaw a $1.6 trillion student loan portfolio, making his office the equivalent to the country's fifth largest bank. For more on what all of this means, let's bring in Professor Sara Goldrick-Rab. Sara is the president and founder of the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice at Temple University. Good to have you with us, Professor. So Senator Elizabeth Warren has said that the federal student loan program was a disaster under the last administration. She celebrated the news of Brown's departure. Tell us a little bit more about what's been going on with student loans for the past 4 years.
Well, over the last 4 years, there have been many Americans who need help both paying for college and recovering from how they had to pay for college. And they're struggling. People don't have enough money to get through school, and they're dropping out in debt with no degree. And people who had to borrow often too much money, more than they'll be able to afford just in order to go to college, are struggling to make those payments. And so they are falling into what we call delinquency when they can't pay, or even default. This can ruin their credit, it can keep them from starting families, and it can do real harm to their futures.
So what could a change in leadership mean for the millions of people with student loans?
Well, it could mean so many things. It's been a while now since someone was in charge at Federal Student Aid who really understands today's college students, who knows, for example, that these are not people going to college to waste money, that these are people going to college with children, people who are going to college to climb out of poverty, and they often come from families without a lot of money. So we need to find ways to make it easier to pay for the education that they need so badly, whether that's a technical certificate, an associate degree, or a bachelor's degree. And the person in charge of FSA, Federal Student Aid, can really make this so much easier for people all over the country.
Well, the problem of crushing student debt is one that our society can't afford to ignore. Recently, the new Biden administration has said that this will be a focus of their time in the White House. So what has newly appointed Education Secretary Miguel Cardona set out as his goals?
Well, he's made it very clear, for example, that people who want to go to college ought to be able to afford to, that they should not have to forego their talent and hard work just because their parents don't have a lot of money, or just because they weren't able to go to college right out of high school. He has said that second chances are important. He has said that equity is important. He's also said that certain things that have been happening over the last several years, things like people becoming homeless just trying to pay for college, that these things are unacceptable. And he has noted the big challenges facing the community college sector in particular, which now educates almost 1 in 2 undergraduates, but receives far less support. A lot of student debt is occurring there, a place that people used to think was free.
Are there any frontrunners now to replace Brown?
Well, he just resigned today, but I have heard of a couple, and one that I want to flag because it's so promising is a woman named Abigail Selden. Abigail has made her career removing obstacles for today's college students and trying to keep people from getting into debt in the first place. She is on the board of a community college. She has done a lot of work to support homeless and hungry college students. And I think this is really important. Federal Student Aid is not a bank. It is not a bank. It is a place that is implementing the most important educational policies in this country. It does not belong in Treasury, and it should not be run by a banker. It needs to be run by someone who really understands the lived experiences of today's college students and recent college graduates, and what the money that we pay for college does for our lives.
Well, you are also an expert in food policy, and I can hear the passion with which you're speaking about this problem. We know that even college students can be homeless, they can be hungry. What can we do to solve this problem?
Well, one of the things that we can do is that we can address the need to bridge policies like SNAP, which is the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise, what we used to call food stamps. We need to bridge that and student financial aid. Right now, the two don't really talk to each other. And so you have students who have a shortfalling on their financial aid, but are not immediately referred to SNAP so that they can afford to eat every day. The person in charge of federal student aid would ideally be someone who can work on that bridge. If someone is qualified for a federal Pell Grant, there's absolutely no reason that we should put more paperwork in front of them. We should simply get them access to the SNAP program. We should also expand the National School Lunch Program to higher education, and that's something that I'm hoping that Secretary Cardona and his administration will take on.
One more question before I let you go. You heard in my introduction that part of what Brown came under criticism for was his handling of the office during this pandemic. As we're looking at potentially restarting a kind of normal and students potentially going back to schools in person, what are the roles that colleges and community colleges can play in helping our nation recover from this crisis?
I think they're going to play an essential role, and we have really good evidence of that. So, in the wake of the Great Recession, the economic recovery depended on people returning to school or starting their education. Many of them went many of them went part-time, not full-time. They weren't able to go full-time. They were caring for families, they had jobs, and so on. And as a result of that, we saw people begin to be able to rise up again and gain some economic security. It's really important that that becomes possible again. You know, community college enrollment in this country fell by almost 24% during the pandemic. And that meant that a disproportionate number of people with children, people who are African American, Latinx families, Indigenous families, they dropped out of college. Their educations are disrupted, and their families are going to have real trouble with economic stability and recovery from the pandemic. So making sure that people who want an education and want to continue their education can is absolutely part of the COVID response and the economic recovery.
Sara Goldrick-Rab, thank you.
Thanks for having me.